My name is Clara and I am 28 years old. I am standing at Gate C42 inside Denver International Airport in Colorado. It is 6:30 in the morning. My grandmother Beatrice is standing right beside me. Both of her fragile hands are tightly wrapped around the handle of a heavy leather suitcase that used to belong to my late grandfather. 9 members of my family are scattered all around us. They are checking their boarding passes, adjusting their expensive carry-on bags, and mindlessly scrolling through their cell phones. Then my father turns to my grandmother. He does not even bother to lower his voice. He looks her right in the eye and says the words that completely shatter my heart. "Mom, I forgot to book your ticket. Just take a taxi and go home." 9 family members hear him say it. The airline gate agent standing behind the counter hears it. An elderly couple waiting in the boarding line turns around to look at us in absolute shock. My grandmother slowly opens her plastic boarding pass holder. There is absolutely nothing inside except a printed itinerary with no flight confirmation number. She silently closes it. She does not cry. She just looks down at her old shoes. But what my father did not know, and what none of my greedy relatives knew, was that abandoning her would eventually cost him absolutely everything he had ever stolen. Not because I had planned a massive revenge right in that exact moment, but because silence has a terrifying way of making the hidden truth very loud. Welcome back to Drama Storytime, where we uncover the darkest family secrets and the incredible power of walking away. If you are new here, this channel brings you intense real-life stories of betrayal, survival, and ultimate karma. Drop a comment with your thoughts as you listen and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single update. Now let me take you back to the beginning to explain exactly how we ended up abandoned at the airport. My grandmother Beatrice was the absolute pillar of our entire family. When my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, he left her a beautiful estate and a very comfortable trust fund. But my father and my 2 wealthy aunts were incredibly greedy. They spent the last decade slowly manipulating her out of her own money. They convinced her to sell her beautiful vintage home and move into a small, dark apartment, claiming it was much better for her physical health. They took control of her bank accounts, promising they were just protecting her financial investments. In reality, they were systematically draining her dry to fund their own luxurious lifestyles. This specific trip was supposed to be a massive 2-week family vacation to a tropical luxury resort to celebrate her 80th birthday. My grandmother was incredibly excited. She had supposedly paid for the entire trip for all 10 of us using her own retirement money. Or at least, that is exactly what my father had told her. The air inside the airport terminal felt incredibly heavy and cold. I stood there looking at the face of my father. I expected him to laugh and say it was just a terrible joke. I expected him to pull the real boarding pass out of his expensive leather jacket. But he did absolutely nothing. He just looked at his shiny luxury watch and sighed in annoyance. My 2 wealthy aunts were standing just a few feet away, holding their designer coffee cups. They did not look shocked. They did not look angry. My Aunt Sarah simply adjusted her silk scarf and told my grandmother that it was probably for the best because the tropical heat would have been too much for her weak heart anyway. They were actually defending him. They were actively justifying the fact that they were abandoning an 80-year-old woman in the middle of a busy airport terminal. The gate agent picked up the microphone and announced the final boarding call for the first-class passengers. My father grabbed his expensive carry-on bag and looked at me. He told me to hurry up because they were closing the doors soon. He actually thought I was going to leave with them. He genuinely believed I was just as rotten and selfish as the rest of his siblings. I looked down at my grandmother. Her fragile hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the handle of her old suitcase. She looked up at me with tears pooling in her beautiful gray eyes. She softly told me to go. She whispered that I should not ruin my expensive vacation just because of a silly ticketing mistake. She was still trying to protect the exact same people who were currently breaking her heart. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my first-class boarding pass. It was a ticket my grandmother had paid for using her hard-earned retirement savings. I looked my father directly in the eye. I did not scream or cause a massive public scene. I simply held the heavy cardstock paper in both of my hands and ripped it straight down the middle. My father turned bright red. He took a step toward me and hissed under his breath. He told me I was acting like an immature child. He reminded me that the ticket cost over $3,000 and I was throwing it away for absolutely no reason. I dropped the torn pieces of paper onto the airport carpet right at his feet. I told him I would rather sit in an empty room with my grandmother than spend a single second on a luxury beach with a family of thieves. The gate agent announced the absolute final boarding call. My father glared at me with pure hatred. He told me I was going to deeply regret my decision. Then he turned his back on us. I stood there and watched my entire family walk down the jet bridge one by one. Not a single person looked back. They completely disappeared down the long tunnel, leaving us entirely alone in the massive empty terminal waiting area. We sat in the uncomfortable airport chairs for a very long time. The plane backed away from the gate and taxied down the runway. I held the hand of my grandmother as we watched the massive aircraft lift into the morning sky. The silence between us was incredibly heavy. It was the loud, terrifying silence of a family completely falling apart. Eventually, the kind gate agent walked over and offered us 2 bottles of water. She looked at my grandmother with deep sympathy and softly apologized for what had just happened. I thanked her and picked up the heavy leather suitcase. I linked my arm through the arm of my grandmother and slowly guided her back toward the airport exit. We took a yellow taxi cab back to the city. The ride took about 45 minutes. Neither of us spoke a single word. When we finally arrived at her apartment building, my heart sank. It was a dark, depressing concrete building located in a very bad part of town. My father had forced her to sell her beautiful sunny house 3 years ago, claiming this cheap apartment was safer and easier to maintain. I unlocked the front door and guided her inside. The apartment smelled like old dust and cheap cleaning supplies. There were very few windows and the furniture was incredibly worn out. I walked into the tiny kitchen and boiled some water to make a pot of chamomile tea. I brought 2 warm mugs into the living room and sat down on the completely faded sofa right next to her. She took a slow sip of her tea and finally let the tears fall. She cried quietly, mourning the children she had raised. She told me she did not understand how a simple booking mistake could have happened. She said my father was usually so careful with all of the financial planning. I set my warm mug down on the coffee table. I looked at her and gently told her it was not a mistake. I told her that my father had intentionally left her off the flight manifest. But as I said the words, a sudden terrifying thought crossed my mind. If my father was bold enough to leave her at the airport, what else was he bold enough to do behind her back? I asked my grandmother where she kept all of her important financial documents and her bank statements. She pointed to a rusty metal filing cabinet in the corner of her tiny bedroom. She told me my father held the keys to everything, but there was a small stack of recent mail she had not opened yet, sitting in the bottom drawer. I walked into the bedroom and opened the heavy metal drawer. Inside was a thick stack of letters from her primary banking institution. Many of them were marked with bright red urgent warnings. I brought the entire stack back into the living room. I asked for her permission to open them. She nodded slowly, looking completely exhausted. I tore open the very first envelope. It was a summary statement from her primary retirement trust fund. The same trust fund that my grandfather had spent 40 years building to ensure she would be safe and comfortable for the rest of her life. I scanned the columns of numbers and felt all the blood rush out of my face. The account balance was absolutely zero. I frantically opened the next envelope. It was a notice of extreme overdraft from her personal checking account. The next letter was a final warning notice from a high-interest credit card company claiming she owed over $80,000. My grandmother had never used a credit card in her entire life. I sat there surrounded by the scattered pieces of paper. The horrible truth hit me like a massive freight train. The luxury vacation was not just a cruel trick. It was a carefully timed escape plan. My father and my wealthy aunts had systematically drained every single penny she owned. They maxed out massive lines of credit in her name, completely bankrupted her trust fund, and then got on an airplane to fly to a tropical island. They left her behind with absolutely nothing but a heavy suitcase and a mountain of their criminal debt. I sat on the faded sofa surrounded by the scattered bank statements. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I thought it might actually break through my chest. The piece of paper in my hands felt heavier than a massive block of solid stone. The account balance printed at the bottom of the page was absolutely zero. I looked up at my grandmother. Beatrice was sitting quietly watching my face change from confusion to absolute horror. She tilted her head slightly and asked me what was wrong. Her voice was so gentle and completely innocent. She genuinely thought my father was just clumsy with booking flight tickets. She had no idea she was completely financially ruined. I took a very deep breath to steady my shaking hands. I slowly moved closer to her and gently took her fragile hands in mine. I looked directly into her beautiful gray eyes and told her the absolute hardest truth I had ever spoken in my entire life. I told her that the money was completely gone. I told her that my father and my two wealthy aunts had not made a simple mistake at the airport terminal. They had systematically drained her entire life savings over the past 3 years. I showed her the final warning notices from the credit card companies. I pointed to the massive cash withdrawals from her primary trust fund. I explained that they had maxed out secret credit cards under her name and transferred all of her money into their own private accounts. The reaction of my grandmother completely shattered my heart. She did not scream or throw things. She simply went completely pale, and her small shoulders dropped as if a massive physical weight had suddenly crushed her. She whispered that it was impossible because they were her children. She said she had raised them to be good, honest people. She started to tremble violently, staring blankly at the massive pile of criminal evidence scattered across the cheap coffee table. She realized in that exact moment that the small, dark apartment she was forced to live in was not for her safety. It was a prison they had built to keep her isolated while they stole the fortune my grandfather had worked 40 years to build. Anger is a very strange emotion. Sometimes it makes you want to scream and break windows. But the anger I felt sitting in that depressing living room was completely cold and perfectly silent. I did not want to yell. I wanted to systematically destroy the people who had done this to her. I stood up and began going through every single piece of paper in the rusty filing cabinet. I spent the next 4 hours matching bank transfer dates with the luxurious purchases my father and my aunts had made over the past few years. I found wire transfers to luxury car dealerships. I found massive withdrawals that perfectly matched the exact dates my Aunt Sarah bought her expensive vacation home in the mountains. They were incredibly arrogant. They thought because Beatrice was elderly and did not understand modern banking, they could simply forge her signature and steal her money in broad daylight without ever getting caught. But they made one massive fatal mistake. They left me behind at the airport. My father was so incredibly greedy and selfish that he assumed I would blindly follow the family onto the airplane and ignore the cruelty. He thought I was just another obedient puppet in his sick financial game. But by leaving us alone, he handed me the absolute perfect opportunity. The entire family was currently flying over the ocean to an isolated tropical luxury resort. They would be completely disconnected from the real world for 14 entire days. They would be sipping expensive cocktails and lounging on the beach, completely unaware that I was standing in the ruins of their massive financial crime, holding all the physical evidence. I looked at my grandmother and told her we were leaving that terrible apartment immediately. I packed her clothing into the heavy leather suitcase and called a private car service. I drove her directly to my own secure apartment on the other side of the city. I set up my spare bedroom with fresh, warm sheets and made sure she was completely comfortable and safe. I cooked her a warm dinner and sat by her bed until she finally fell asleep from sheer emotional exhaustion. When I was absolutely sure she was sleeping, I walked into my home office and locked the door behind me. I laid out all the forged bank documents, the fake credit card statements, and the history of fraudulent wire transfers across my large wooden desk. I turned on my desk lamp and opened my personal laptop. I did not work in the financial sector, but my best friend from college was a senior investigator for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Her name was Rachel, and she absolutely despised white-collar criminals who preyed on the elderly. I picked up my cell phone and dialed her number. It was very late on a Saturday night, but Rachel answered on the third ring. I did not waste any time with polite small talk. I told her that my father and my aunts had just committed massive elder abuse and wire fraud against my 80-year-old grandmother. I told her I had original documents proving they stole millions of dollars and that the criminals were currently out of the country on a luxury vacation for the next 2 weeks. Rachel went completely silent for a few seconds. Then she asked me to start scanning the documents and sending them to her secure federal email address immediately. She told me that elder financial abuse was a massive federal priority, and if the evidence was solid, we could freeze all of their assets before they even returned from the beach. I spent the entire night scanning every single piece of paper. I built a massive digital fortress of undeniable proof. The 14-day countdown had officially started. My family thought they had successfully escaped their crimes, but they had actually just walked perfectly into a trap they could never escape. Monday morning arrived with a cold, heavy rain pouring over the city. I woke up early and made a warm breakfast for my grandmother. She was sitting by the large window in my living room, wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked so incredibly small and fragile. but she also looked peaceful for the first time in 3 long years. I kissed her forehead and gently told her I was going to a very important meeting to fix everything. I drove my car downtown to the massive federal building. My friend Rachel was waiting for me inside a highly secure conference room on the 5th floor. She had printed out every single bank document I scanned over the weekend and pinned them to a massive white board. There were 3 other federal financial investigators standing in the room. They looked at me with deep sympathy and absolute determination. Rachel introduced her team and explained that they had spent their entire Sunday verifying the bankroating numbers and tracking the fraudulent wire transfers. She told me the evidence I provided was absolutely bulletproof. My father and my 2 aunts had committed massive federal wire fraud, severe elder financial abuse, and multiple counts of felony forgery. Rachel sat down across from me and explained the exact legal strategy we were going to use. She said that because the criminals had crossed international borders and transferred stolen funds across multiple state lines, this was no longer just a small local family dispute. It was a major federal criminal investigation. The primary goal was to immediately stop the financial bleeding and secure whatever stolen money was left. Rachel handed me a thick stack of legal papers. It was an emergency petition for temporary financial conservatorship. Because my grandmother was the direct victim of severe financial abuse, a federal judge had already signed an emergency legal order early that morning. The order granted me absolute legal control over her remaining assets and her stolen identity. I picked up a pen and signed my name on the dotted line. As soon as my pen lifted from the heavy paper, Rachel picked up her secure phone and made a single call to the Federal Banking Commission. Within exactly 60 seconds, every single bank account holding company and high-interest credit card belonging to my father and my 2 wealthy aunts was completely frozen. The federal agents seized the deed to the expensive mountain vacation home my Aunt Sarah had secretly purchased. They placed massive legal liens on the luxury sports cars my father had bought using the retirement funds of my grandmother. The criminals were entirely locked out of the global financial system. They could not withdraw a single dollar. They could not transfer any funds between accounts. Their massive credit limits were permanently suspended without any warning. I sat in the silent conference room and imagined what my father was doing at that exact moment. He was probably sitting on a white sandy beach drinking an incredibly expensive cocktail under a tropical palm tree. He genuinely believed he had pulled off the absolute perfect crime. He thought he had successfully dumped his elderly mother in a cheap, dark apartment and abandoned his rebellious daughter at the airport terminal. He thought he was completely invincible and brilliant. He had absolutely no idea that thousands of miles away, a dedicated team of federal agents had just severed his entire financial lifeline. He was currently standing on a beautiful island, holding a leather wallet full of completely useless plastic cards. I thanked Rachel and her amazing team for their incredible speed. I drove back to my apartment feeling a massive sense of genuine relief wash over my entire body. When I walked through the front door, my grandmother was watching a classic movie on the television. I sat down next to her and gently held her hand. I did not tell her all the terrifying legal details because I did not want to cause her any more physical or emotional stress. I simply told her that she was completely safe now and that the bad people could never steal from her again. Over the next 5 days, we built a beautiful, quiet routine in my apartment. We cooked warm dinners together. We took slow walks in the nearby park, and we read books in the evening. It was the peaceful and loving life she actually deserved. But while we were living in absolute peace, a massive financial storm was finally hitting the tropical luxury island. On the 6th day of their expensive 14-day vacation, my cell phone suddenly lit up with an international incoming call. I looked down at the caller identification screen. It was my father. He had not tried to contact me a single time since he left me at the airport gate. I stared at the glowing screen as the phone vibrated across my wooden kitchen table. I did not pick it up. I let it ring until it went straight to the automated voicemail. 10 minutes later, another international call came through. This time it was my Aunt Sarah. Her call also went completely ignored. Over the next 2 hours, my cell phone rang 27 times. They were desperately trying to reach me. They were finally standing at expensive island restaurants and luxury resort boutiques, getting their premium credit cards completely declined. They were trying to call their banks only to be told that their accounts were under a mandatory federal lock. The trap had officially snapped shut, and they were finally feeling the very first sharp bite of absolute panic. I sat alone at my wooden kitchen table and listened to the desperate voicemails left on my cell phone. The progression of the messages was incredibly satisfying to hear. The very first message from my father was full of his usual arrogance and anger. He demanded that I call his personal bank immediately. He claimed there was a stupid security hold on his platinum credit card, and he ordered me to fix it because he was busy trying to charter a private yacht for the afternoon. He still genuinely believed he was in complete control of the universe. But his tone completely changed by the fourth voicemail. His voice was shaking slightly and he sounded out of breath. He said the hotel management had approached him during an expensive group dinner. The luxury resort had a strict policy of running a mid-stay authorization check on the credit cards of all their guests to cover the massive room charges and expensive bar tabs. The platinum card of my father had completely declined. When he confidently handed them a second premium card, it declined as well. He told me the hotel manager had politely asked him to step away from his table in front of dozens of wealthy strangers. He was absolutely humiliated in the exact high society setting he worshipped. The 12th voicemail was from my Aunt Sarah. She was crying hysterically. She told me she had gone to an exclusive jewelry boutique on the island to buy a custom diamond bracelet. When her card declined, the store security actually accused her of using stolen plastic and forcefully escorted her out of the building. She begged me to wire them some emergency cash from the retirement fund of my grandmother. She had absolutely no idea that the federal government was currently holding that exact fund as primary evidence in a massive criminal investigation against her. I did not reply to a single message. I deleted all the voicemails and turned my phone completely off. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and walked into the living room where Beatrice was peacefully working on a beautiful watercolor painting. She was painting a bright yellow sunflower. I sat next to her and smiled. She did not need to know that her greedy children were currently drowning in a massive ocean of their own horrible consequences. Meanwhile, on the tropical island, the situation escalated rapidly. Without a single working credit card or any access to their bank accounts, my family was completely stranded in paradise. The luxury resort gave them exactly 24 hours to provide a valid method of payment. When my father failed to produce the money, the resort management took immediate and brutal action. They deactivated the electronic keys to their expensive ocean view suites. Security guards escorted my father and my aunts back to their rooms and stood in the doorway while they furiously packed their designer clothing. They were publicly evicted from the five-star property in the middle of the afternoon. Other wealthy vacationers watched from the pristine swimming pool as my arrogant family dragged their heavy suitcases down the beautiful cobblestone driveway. They had no money for an airport taxi. They had no money for a decent meal. They were forced to drag their heavy luggage for 3 miles under the brutal tropical sun just to reach a cheap public bus stop. The people who thought they were absolute royalty were now sitting on a dusty wooden bench sweating profusely and fighting viciously with each other. My father blamed my aunts for spending too much money. My aunt screamed at my father for not managing the bank accounts properly before they left. The fake loyalty they had built on stolen money instantly collapsed the very second they experienced real financial hardship. They eventually managed to use the last few crumpled dollar bills in their pockets to buy cheap bus tickets to the local international airport. They thought they could simply catch their return flight home a few days early and figure out the banking glitch from the comfort of their expensive suburban houses. They had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare was waiting for them the exact second they landed on American soil. My father and my 2 wealthy aunts spent the next 48 hours trapped inside a crowded international airport terminal. They slept on cold metal benches and drank tap water from the dirty public restrooms. The beautiful tropical tan they had acquired during their first few days was completely masked by pure physical exhaustion and deep stress. When the day of their original return flight finally arrived, they boarded the massive airplane looking absolutely miserable. They sat in their expensive first-class seats, but they could not enjoy a single moment of it. Their credit cards were still completely dead, so they could not even buy an expensive glass of wine to calm their shaking nerves. They spent the entire 8-hour flight back to American soil, arguing in aggressive whispers. My father still believed this was just a massive technical banking error. He genuinely thought he would march into his local bank branch on Monday morning, yell at a random manager, and get all of his stolen millions unlocked. He was completely blinded by his own towering arrogance. The airplane finally landed at Denver International Airport. It was the exact same airport where they had abandoned my 80-year-old grandmother just 14 days ago. They gathered their heavy designer bags and walked off the plane. They headed directly toward the Federal Customs and Border Protection checkpoint. My father aggressively pushed his way to the front of the line. He slammed his passport down on the desk of the border agent. The agent scanned the passport and looked at his computer screen. The screen immediately flashed with a massive red federal alert. The border agent did not say a single word. He simply pressed a silent alarm button under his desk and asked my father to step to the side. My father rolled his eyes and loudly complained about the terrible customer service. My 2 aunts stood right behind him, complaining about how tired they were and how badly they wanted to go home. They did not have to wait very long. 2 heavy metal doors opened near the security checkpoint. A team of 6 federal financial crime agents walked directly toward my family. My friend Rachel was leading the group. She was wearing a dark suit and carrying a thick leather folder. She looked absolutely terrifying in the best way possible. My father puffed up his chest and demanded to know what was going on. He told the agents they were making a massive mistake and that he was a very important, wealthy man. Rachel did not smile. She stopped walking right in front of him and calmly opened her leather folder. She asked him to confirm his full legal name. He aggressively barked his name at her. Rachel nodded slowly. She looked him directly in the eye and stated loud enough for the entire customs hall to hear that he and his two sisters were officially under federal arrest. She listed the charges one by one: massive wire fraud, aggravated elder financial abuse, felony forgery, and grand theft. The color completely drained from the face of my father. His jaw practically hit the floor. My Aunt Sarah let out a loud, terrified scream and dropped her expensive designer handbag. The heavy bag hit the floor, and her useless platinum credit card spilled out across the shiny airport tiles. My father started to violently shake. He tried to backtrack and lie. He claimed he had absolute legal power of attorney over the bank accounts of my grandmother and that he was just protecting her money. Rachel simply closed her folder. She looked at him with pure disgust and told him that temporary power of attorney does not give him the legal right to drain a massive trust fund and secretly buy a luxury beach house. She signaled the other agents. 3 federal agents stepped forward and placed cold steel handcuffs on the wrists of my father and my 2 aunts. The wealthy criminals who thought they were entirely untouchable were publicly marched through the crowded airport terminal in heavy chains. Hundreds of travelers watched them walk by. It was the exact same airport where they had thrown my grandmother away like garbage just 2 weeks prior. The circle of karma was absolutely perfect. The federal holding facility was incredibly cold and completely devoid of any luxury. My father and my 2 aunts were placed in separate concrete interrogation rooms. They were stripped of their expensive designer belts and forced to wear bright orange jumpsuit uniforms. The terrifying reality of their massive crimes was finally crashing down on their arrogant shoulders. Rachel decided to interrogate my father first. She walked into the small gray room and sat down across from him at a cold metal table. He was trembling violently, but he still tried to maintain his fake superiority. He demanded to speak to his expensive corporate lawyers immediately. He arrogantly stated that he could easily afford the best legal defense team in the entire state, and that she was going to lose her federal job for arresting him. Rachel just smiled a very calm and calculated smile. She opened her heavy file and laid the financial documents out on the metal table. She softly informed him that he could not afford any lawyers at all. She explained that every single bank account he owned was currently frozen under a strict federal mandate. She told him that the expensive suburban house he lived in was seized by the government earlier that morning because it was purchased using stolen retirement funds. Even his luxury cars were towed away by federal agents while he was sitting on an airplane. My father stared at her in absolute disbelief. He started to hyperventilate. The confident businessman routine completely vanished. He desperately tried to throw his own sisters under the bus to save himself. He claimed that my Aunt Sarah and my Aunt Martha were the real masterminds behind the entire financial theft. He said they forced him to sign the forged documents and that he was just an innocent victim of their greed. Rachel pressed a small button on the table. A speaker in the corner of the room crackled to life. It was a live audio feed from the interrogation room next door. My Aunt Sarah was crying hysterically to another federal agent. She was loudly confessing to everything, but she was completely blaming my father. She told the agent that my father had orchestrated the entire plan to isolate my grandmother and steal her millions. She said my father was the exact person who intentionally ripped up the flight ticket so they could abandon the old woman at the airport. The loyalty of thieves is completely useless when they are facing federal prison time. My Aunt Martha was interrogated in a third room down the hall. She was the sister who had secretly bought a massive collection of expensive jewelry using the stolen money. The agents had raided her luxury apartment and found bags of diamonds hidden in her closet. She tried to claim they were historical family heirlooms. The agent simply showed her the receipts she had signed using the forged signature of my grandmother. Martha completely collapsed and started begging for a plea deal. She offered to testify against her own brother and sister in exchange for a lighter prison sentence. They were tearing each other apart like starving wolves. My father buried his face in his shaking hands. He finally realized there was absolutely no way out. The concrete walls were completely closing in on him. He looked up at Rachel with tear-filled eyes and asked her how the federal government found out so quickly. He said they had hidden the money through complex wire transfers that should have taken years to track down. Rachel leaned forward and looked directly into his defeated eyes. She told him that a very smart and fiercely loyal granddaughter had found the hidden bank statements in a rusty filing cabinet. She told him that Clara had stayed behind at the airport and chosen to protect the grandmother he threw away. Rachel explained that Clara had handed the federal government the exact blueprint to destroy his entire life. When my father heard my name, a sickening realization washed over his face. The quiet, obedient daughter he had abandoned at the terminal was the exact person who engineered his ultimate downfall. He let out a loud, pathetic sob. He realized that leaving us behind was the single greatest mistake of his entire pathetic life. While he was crying in a cold concrete room, I was sitting in my warm kitchen baking fresh apple pie with my grandmother. Beatrice was laughing at a joke I made, and the entire apartment smelled like cinnamon and butter. She had absolutely no idea that her terrible children were currently locked in federal holding cells, facing decades in prison. I decided to keep the brutal details away from her. I just wanted her to enjoy the sweet taste of peace. The federal indictment came down exactly 3 months after the arrest at the airport. It was a massive legal document containing over 50 distinct counts of financial fraud and severe elder abuse. The local news media got hold of the story, and it quickly became a massive public scandal. The faces of my father and my 2 aunts were broadcasted across every single television screen in the entire state. The wealthy high society friends they had desperately tried to impress completely disowned them overnight.